Well, you're listening to Meeting House here on Faith Radio, and I'm pleased to welcome back to the program Carl Gallups, Senior Pastor of the Hickory Hammock Baptist Church, which is located in Milton, Florida. He is the author of the relatively new book called The Magic Man in the Sky, and Pastor had you on the air several weeks ago as that book was being launched. And we were talking just a bit about the background of the title and some of the subject matter. Sounds like that this concept has really resonated with quite a few people, hasn't it?
Oh, Bob, it has. First of all, thank you for having me back on today. How gracious of you. And yes, God has blessed this book, Bob. It's now a #1 bestseller on Amazon and has been just continually. It was rave reviewed by the Washington Times just a few days ago. Doing television and radio interviews left and right. People are going crazy over the book. God has just anointed it and is using it all over the world.
What is it about the concept of the book that you feel is connecting with people in the way that it has?
Well, I think there are 2 or 3 things. Number one, it's just a sweeping defense of the Christian faith, dealing with dozens of topics that are contemporary. Now, some of the topics have been around since the beginning of man, like what's the meaning of life. But some of the topics are very contemporary, like the title. A contemporary argument is, well, I would rather believe in settled scientific fact than some magic man in the sky. So I took that very concept, that argument, turned it around, used it in the title, The Magic Man in the Sky, and I think people are just finding it a refreshing and just a fresh look at how to defend their faith. I use a lot of humor. I use a lot of good, solid science, good, solid logic, tons of contextually interpreted scripture, several illustrations that are completely unique to me, so they're fresh and they give great illustrative nature to the truths of God's Word, and I think people are just connecting with it. They're finding it not only as a tool in their own arsenal, but and a way of educating themselves, but they're finding it as a witnessing tool. I can't tell you how many people have said, I've ordered multiple copies after reading it. I'm sending them to my friends. I'm sending them to my atheist uncle, to my skeptic brother. And it's a book that you're going to put in your library and refer to over and over again. It's not something you read once and say, oh, well, that was cool, because it's just so full of information.
Well, and something we talked about last time you were on the program was the connection between science and faith. And scientific discoveries, I believe, are continuing to be unveiled that support what the Scriptures have said for years. And I think one of those instances, something a lot of people are talking about this week, it has continued to be a trending topic, and that is the discovery of this so-called God particle. You might see the phrase HIGGS boson. Well, there are, of course, the spin in much of the secular and scientific media as well. This gives us another clue into the origin of the universe. In fact, someone that was researching this particle said that this shows how matter obtained mass after the universe was created in the Big Bang. Many in the scientific community are saying, well, this God particle is another key to unlocking the mystery of how we came to be, the origins. Well, in a sense, yeah, they're correct, but I believe that the research surrounding the God particle actually shows yet more evidence for a designer. So let's kind of rewind just a bit. Let's take our listeners back to this concept of the God particle and give them a little definition. What is it? What are we talking about here?
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, well, bless the scientists' hearts. This is amazing science, and I'm a quantum physics geek, so I can explain this. I do understand it, and what I'd like to do is to break it down to its simplest level so that all of our listeners can have an understanding of it, because the understanding of the science is essential for the day in which we live. But the theological implications are tremendously important. So let me help all of the listeners understand. Start with a quick, basic, simple physics lesson. Atoms produce molecules, and molecules produce matter. In other words, 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen produces the molecule of what we know as water, H2O. Well, of course, water is matter. Well, all matter has mass. That is, we have the ability to measure it. It takes up space. It has volume. Some matter has solidity to it. So solids, liquids, and gases all are considered a part of matter. Our whole reality is made up of matter. Everything that is real, everything that exists has matter. It has the ability to be measured. So atoms create molecules, molecules create matter, and matter has mass. Now, let's go back to the atom. For the longest, mankind thought the atom was the smallest particle known to man. But now we know that atoms are made up of even tinier parts, like protons, neutrons, and electrons. But now, in the last 80 years or so, we have discovered that those particles are made up of tinier particles. And we call this the study of quantum physics or quantum mechanics. Quantum means, it's a Latin word, it means how many or how small does it go. And so we know that that atoms are made up of tiny, tiny particles, but also they're made up of what scientists call bosons. Bosons are the energy particles, the particles that hold all the other particles together. But now here is the conundrum of physics. Atoms make molecules, molecules make matter, matter has mass. The problem is that nothing about an atom has mass. The particles that make up matter have zero mass. So the question is, how can zero equal everything? Mm-hmm. How can something that has no mass create everything that has to have mass, or we don't have life? How can that be? Well, that's been a conundrum for scientists for many years. So a guy by the name of Peter Higgs in the 1960s, a physicist, developed a theory, and that's why it's called the Higgs boson, that somewhere out there has to be a boson, an energy particle, that imparts mass to all the other particles, especially if it's given the proper energy field with which through to pass. So he developed this theory, and for the longest it's been called the Higgs boson theory. In the meantime, in the 1990s, a guy by the name of Letterman came along, another physicist. He came along and wrote a book called The God Particle, and the subtitle is, If the Universe is the Answer, What Was the Question? So that's an awesome title, by the way. But he called it the God particle, talking about Higgs boson, because, number one, he says it's so elusive, and number two, it's so central to creation. In other words, we can't have matter unless we have mass. But how can we have mass? How can we have mass when everything that creates mass has no mass? So, in the last several decades, scientists have feverishly been trying to discover. So the Hadron Collider over in CERN, they recreated some decades ago in this big Hadron Collider, the size of a mall. They recreated what they called the Big Bang, and by colliding the various elements of atoms and then watching for decades the result. And they think they might have kind of, sort of, pretty sure have found what they're calling now the Higgs boson. They think they have found a particle that once it passes through this certain field, that it imparts mass to all the other particles. Now, in proclaiming they found that, the complete secularists, the ones that are leaving an intelligent designer completely out of the equation, they're hailing this as the greatest scientific discovery of our day, because this proves that we don't need a God. It's just this little particle that imparts mass. But now let me give an illustration to you, Bob, and to your listeners that shows the ludicrousness of leaving an intelligent designer out of this. First of all, discovering the Higgs boson is an amazing feat of science, and I'm thrilled about that possibility. But here's the deal. Here's an illustration. In your studio, Bob, floating in the air are tiny dust particles that you cannot see, but they're there. And tomorrow when you come in, you look on the floor and there's a dust ball. And you say, well, now where'd that come from? I vacuumed last night before I left. How is there a dust ball laying here in the middle of my floor? Well, what happened is the tiny electromagnetic charges in the air, electrostatic charges in the air, brought several of those dust particles together, formed a dust ball, and it fell to the floor. So those invisible particles were pulled together by an energy source, and it created something, so to speak. Now, that's a rough illustration of what physicists are looking for. They're looking for that energy source, that boson, that Higgs boson, that pulls these particles together that have no mass and imparts to them mass. Well, But to say that then proves we don't need God is tantamount to saying that the dust particle could become life.
Right.
Not only could the dust ball, not only could the dust ball become life, but it could become 20 million different species of life with all of their systems and subsystems and sub-subsystems in place, and with the ability for some of those species to think and to create computers and internet and libraries and radio and have talk shows. And, it's an amazing leap to say that we have found the energy source that imparts matter, to then say, now we don't need God. Because the logical scientific conclusion is, all you have found is one of the tools that God uses to do the rest of the creative work. Does that help?
That is outstanding. Excellent. Well, Carl Gallups is joining us today here on the Meeting House on Faith Radio, and we are giving some analysis, or he is giving some analysis today. I'm just listening and taking it in. Some great thoughts here with respect to science and this whole business of the God particle or the Higgs boson, this energy source. And you put it so well. This is a tool that Creator God has used in the order or the design, I believe, of His creation. So for the Christian, when we hear of a scientific discovery, I look at this God particle and the supposed discovery of it, or this as being one of the building blocks of creation, and say, hey, this is another tool that I have in order to point to a designer or a creator. Talk about the implications for the Christian.
Yeah, well, the implication for the Christian is this. Christians should never be afraid of true truth. In fact, my book talks about the difference between truth and true truth. For a while it was true that the earth was flat, but the true truth is that it's round. And so true truth, true scientific discoveries, Christians should elate in that. I think God delights in revealing the complexity of His nature and how marvelous and how awesome His creation is. And so, yes, I'm excited. As I said in the beginning, I'm kind of a physics geek. I'm excited about this possibility, but this doesn't shake my faith at all. As a matter of fact, it gives more strength to it because, again, I know the real science behind it, and the real science is that once this Higgs boson is discovered, it in no way can an energy field impart life. It might be able to impart mass, but it does not and cannot impart life. And it cannot impart a consciousness and intelligence. And again, the 20 million species of life. A Higgs boson cannot do that. Now, it can be the tool used to describe how these zero mass elements that make up our life impart mass to matter. It can be used for that. But to make the giant leap that this Higgs boson is the particle that explains away God is utter ludicrousness. And so the Christian, the implication for the Christian is, man, rejoice in these amazing scientific discoveries. But once you know the truth, there's no need for it to shake your faith at all. In fact, it should strengthen your faith. Well,
and really you think about the chances of something like this type of particle giving birth to or creating the energy for mass, for the design of the atom, the complexity of all of these small particles. How does that happen by chance? Even this collider that has been built to simulate, supposedly, the circumstances surrounding the Big Bang Theory, this was something that was built by man. There was a design of this collider. It's just not something that's happening in the middle of nothingness.
Yeah, well, as a matter of fact, the scientists have set themselves up at a much smaller scale as God. And think about it. Let's pretend like they are God. They created the Big Bang. Now they're waiting to see what will happen. Okay, now we've discovered a boson that imparts mass. Okay, that's really cool. But then what I say to these scientists is, okay, now that you've got this little thing of mass created, impart to it life. Give life to that mass. And the scientist says, well, I can't do that. Well, of course you can't. And neither can the boson.
Right.
So you know the old joke among Christians, I believe in the Big Bang. God spoke and bang, it happened. Well, I mean, God could have used a Big Bang scenario to begin everything, but again, God has to impart life. Once matter exists, it does not pop to life by itself.
Well, some great insight for us today, and I'd like to just close by having you elaborate just a bit on a concept you shared earlier, the difference between truth and true truth. We've been concentrating a lot on absolute truth here recently on Faith Radio. Talk about the differences between truth and true truth as we close.
Well, I will. Well, there's so many ways to illustrate it. The simple way, of course, is flat Earth, round Earth. But let me use a more modern. Let's just talk about evolution very, very quickly, just at the skim of it. But this will help people to understand. Evolution studies through genetic understanding now of DNA and the human genome, or the genome of living things. We know that speciation takes place. In other words, you have the dog kind. But in the dog kind, there are many different species of dogs. Okay, so evolutionists are fond of speaking of speciation, and that proves that evolution is true. Well, okay, so there's a truth that speciation occurs. Well, the Bible doesn't deny that. Matter of fact, the Bible has examples of speciation. But then evolution makes the giant leap that speciation proves that one kind can become another kind. Well, it doesn't prove any such thing. So there's a true truth, speciation, but then there's the quote, truth that evolution has promulgated throughout the world for the last several decades, that we don't need a God, one species becomes another species, and the fossil evidence proves it. Well, but wait, there is no such fossil evidence, and we don't have any scientific evidence that shows one kind becomes another kind. As a matter of fact, what DNA says is that dogs have always been dogs, and humans have always been humans, and monkeys have always been monkeys. That's what true truth says. So there's an illustration. There's a battle continually, Bob, between so-called truth and true truth. The so-called truth of our culture and our day is that evolution is how we got here. But the true truth of real science is that an intelligent designer had to be involved.
Well, science and faith are not mutually exclusive, and we've been taught so much. We've accepted certain things as fact that there is not the evidence to support them. So we've been taught these things, we've accepted them as a culture, and there are people like yourself as a Christian apologist and a speaker, a communicator, that are saying, hey, wait a minute, let's take a closer look and really see the evidence of God. And here's a great example with this Higgs boson, this God particle. And we appreciate the insight that you brought to us today. The magic man in the sky, the latest from Carl Gallups. Tell us where we can find you online.
Yeah, thank you. CarlGallups.com is where you can find out everything.
The Washington Times calls it a must-read book, a muscular defense of the Christian faith, an arsenal of powerful rebuttals against Christian bashers. Amazon Books calls it a #1 bestseller. I call it blessed and used by the Lord. Considering the times in which we now live, you need this book. Available at Amazon.com and the WND Superstore.